Hello, everybody. Welcome to Downtime Activities, and welcome to our sort of short discussion video series that we have yet to come up with a creative name for. We already have our sort of bonus action podcast series where we have much longer form discussions about topics related to storytelling and playing tabletop RPGs. And this is very similar to that, but much shorter, because some topics either just aren't worth the effort of trying to talk about them for an hour, or we don't necessarily feel like there's quite that much meat to dig into, but they're discussions that we feel like are important anyway.
Absolutely.
Some geared towards players, some geared towards dungeon masters or game masters. And this is one of the latter. This is something that... this is going to be an interesting conversation because it has an immense amount of potential to really make stories and campaigns interesting and really drive whole arcs and really let characters shine in unique ways and like everybody just like, you know, have a lot of fun and have these big reveals, as well as an immense amount of potential to go horribly, terribly wrong.
High variance with this one, absolutely.
So, the question is relatively simple. How much is a game master allowed to go messing around with the backstory of player characters?
And that's a tricky question to answer. And it's one that has a lot of... there's a lot of variety to what the answer I think I would give to that question. It's very dependent on the character, on the player, on the DM-player relationship, how well you know each other, how well you know this person and the characters they build, and the style of backstory that character creates. Obviously, if the character is playing an amnesiac who has no knowledge of their backstory, they're asking you to build something strange into it.
Exactly. It's very cut and dried in kind of a couple of circumstances, I think. If the player is intentionally leaving holes in their backstory for the game master to fill, you know, they're statting out their fighter who is raised by their grumpy old uncle, and they have no idea who their parents were, and their uncles very specifically never told them, you know, who their parents were. They're asking and that's probably part of the conversation, is, you know, they're setting up their backstory in a way that the game master gets to fill in the holes. You know, they get to be revealed as the missing crown prince, and you know, rising to the throne or refusing to rise to the throne ends up being a whole chunk of their character arc. Or they end up being the son of one of the main villains, if you want to go the Star Wars route with it.
That's impossible.
That's impossible! Throws themselves...
down giant Bespin chute.
Yeah. Exactly. See, we're on the same page. It's very cut and dried in that circumstance. Like, obviously the DM gets to go messing around with their character backstory quite a bit. Or if the game master is setting up a campaign in a specific way, and the player characters are just sort of making characters to fit a brief. You know, these are the types of characters that I want for this campaign, or, you know, this is kind of what your backstory is.
Everybody's backstory needs to be tied towards this concept in some way.
Or, you know, you're all orphans from, you know, this city that was destroyed in a war 20 years ago. You know, you've been sort of living together as a loose family ever since. Like, that's pretty cut and dry, too, because theoretically, at the outset of it, the players are all agreeing to be in that campaign and to make characters to fit that concept. When a player has a well-established backstory, this question gets much more difficult to answer.
And I definitely go back to, like, blanket statement to start with, entirely dependent on your relationship with the player. And you should have... ideally a good working relationship between DM and play group. It's ideal that you have a pretty well-established friend group that's playing together.
Right.
That's not the case for everybody, but in that case you tend to know what kind of buttons you're going to push and stuff like that for your players and what to avoid. That aside, it's very important when messing it all with a character's story in general that you're taking into account the kind of character that the player intended to make.
Right.
You can fundamentally change things about their backstory that are interesting and make for a good story, but you don't want to fundamentally make it change who their character is in a way that will be unpleasant to them.
Right.
You don't want this twist in their backstory to be something that kind of takes the wind out of the sails of what their whole driving force was. And at times, you can... I think it's ideal, but also tricky to do right. You can kind of ask the player indirectly about some stuff of their backstory in a way that will give you some more of that freedom. For instance, you don't want to say, hey, is it cool if your dad is secretly the villain of the campaign? Because I think that'd be a cool story arc.
Right.
Then they're like, oh, great. Sure, that'd be cool, but now I know it's coming. It's
right.
not going to have any wow factor. But if you're like, do you have an established story for what happened or what the story behind with your parents are? And they don't, they're like, no, I'm not really sure. I hadn't really thought about that. And be like, do you care if it's something kind of cryptic and then I maybe do something with it later?
Right.
Like having that kind of a conversation gives you that freedom with their go-ahead.
And then they might be expecting a little bit of a reveal, but they don't know what that reveal is.
Exactly.
You know, and it's exactly sort of twists like that I have in mind when it's like, it would be a lot of fun, you know, halfway through the campaign to reveal that this character's parents aren't who he thought they were. You know, and then there's kind of a bunch of cryptic stuff leading up to it that's making the character start to wonder what's going on, and then you can pull off that reveal. It can define whole arcs of the story. And it could be a really cool moment, or it could really annoy some people. And that's where it is very important to know your players and to know the characters they've made and to have that relationship. It's an element of a social contract thing.
Absolutely.
You know, like, I'm very much the type of player where, like, if you pulled that on me halfway through a game, I would think it was really cool. It's like, yeah, it's changed what I thought about my own character, but it's like, I just trust you well enough, and we've been friends long enough that it's like, I'm not going to be mad at you for pulling that kind of twist. And like, you know, and I would love the surprise reveal of you know, that would kind of come along with that. And I think most of our playgroup's really in the same boat. I think you could absolutely pull it off with Maddie G. I think you could absolutely pull it off with Costigan. I think Jocelyn would be extremely excited about something like that. Like, you can, like, we just know each other well enough that, like, that type of thing will go over fairly well. But it still has to sort of fit within certain boundaries. And I think it's a good idea, you know, it's a very good idea, as you mentioned, to, like, make sure it, like, isn't necessarily messing with the character concept or, like, you know, what they sort of envisioned for their character. You know, you might be forcing a character to deal with a new situation and, you know, maybe a kind of more personal one, but without you, like, sort of an outside force coming in and intrinsically changing the character concept itself.
Yeah, and it should always be a thing that makes that character more dynamic and more interesting. It should never feel like a haha gotcha moment. If it ever is that kind of like, haha, I changed this thing about it, now your backstory is so weird and different than what you envisioned, like, it should never feel like that. And I think that there's some of that, like, humor plays a big part in games. The games we play, jokes and humor and stuff comes up with that. But you don't want to turn somebody's backstory into something that feels like a mockery of what they thought it was.
Right.
So you need to be intentional and thoughtful in that regard in a big way. And you need to remember, as the DM, you control, let's say you're a DM of 4 players.
Right.
You control everything in existence besides 4 individuals.
Right.
And if you take that little bit of control that player has and you take it away from them in some regard in a way that's unpleasant to them, that is going to be very uncomfortable and unpleasant for that person. You have all this control. They have this person that they get to control and they get to drive the action and the story of. And you don't want to take that control away in any sort of way that's not going to make it a more positive experience.
Right.
And that all comes back to understanding that player, understanding their character, and knowing how you can alter and change without those hurt feelings.
Well, you know, and it's part of the reason I'm never a big fan of a lot of older D&D stuff in particular has effects that would change alignment or stuff like that. Like, I think by and large those kinds of personality changes and stuff should come from the players and not from the game master in regards to the player characters. Because, like, you're absolutely right. the player characters are quite purposefully the thing you don't have control of.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of game masters probably wish they had some more control over their players.
Would be the fun in that, though.
But exactly, they are what they are, and apart from sort of working with the players to make sure that their characters mesh into the world and into the story, you shouldn't have all that much control over them, and you should let them be their own people, because ultimately that's the point of the game, and that's how everybody has fun. Mm-hmm. I think there's certain amounts of control that game masters shouldn't have, which is why this becomes a sticky question.
So what do you think is some good advice, apart from there's kind of that obvious advice of know your players, know their characters.
Right.
That is the big takeaway, I think, from this. But there's a lot of groups that are newer, or maybe kind of like if it's more web games or new meeting groups, anything along those lines, where you don't have a super long established play track. You haven't been playing together for 8, 9, 10 years, and so you don't have that sort of, I know what kind of players I have and what they're comfortable and uncomfortable with and what they'd enjoy and not enjoy. In those kind of situations, what do you think is good advice for how to go about this stuff?
I mean, I think regardless of whether you have an established play group or not, don't do this to every character. This should be a very rare thing if you do it at all.
Don't even do it in every campaign.
Right,
let alone
exactly.
to every character.
Because it's one of those things that player characters will start picking up on, and then it's like, oh, who's it going to be this campaign that turns out to be the son of the king or the son of the main villain? Which, like, you'll get more mileage out of it if it's spread out anyway, and you don't want to just do it to all the characters within a party. But I think even new groups, at least a decent game master is going to pick up pretty early on like which of the party members he could probably pull this off with, and they wouldn't get offended or annoyed, or they might find this neat. I think so much of like kind of just personality and stuff gets writ large across Dungeons. Playing Dungeons and Dragons together is such a great way to get to know people. You end up knowing them much better in a much shorter period of time, because you're seeing both them at the table and the way they respond to everything going on, but also the way their characters responding to everything going on. So I think you'll pick up on pretty quickly who you could maybe do it with and who you probably shouldn't try it with. I think there's certain levels of detailed backstories. If a backstory gets detailed enough, it's not worth the effort. It has to be it has to sort of fit a middle ground in terms of detailed backstories, where stuff is, you have enough detail to work with, but it's not too detailed to make it like impossible to do. I mean, those are, I think, just two of the kind of big things, and like by and large, for the most part, just don't do it. It's an interesting idea. I think you could get really good mileage out of it, but you need to be very sparing with it. And if you're going to do it initially, do it in small ways. Do it in ways that maybe don't impact, the whole, plane hopping story that you're telling over the course of your grand 1 through 20 D&D campaign. Save those really big character reveals, those really big character changes for further on down the line.
I think the last bit of advice I'd give in that regard is, if you are not confident it will land well, don't do it.
Right.
And that's kind of just another blanket statement on this. Don't hope it'll go well. Know with pretty high confidence it will go well. This isn't something that will add so much to your game that your game will not be a quality game if it's not included in your campaign. It's something that's interesting and can add a lot of mileage and a cool twist moment that can be very fun for you and the party. But if you're not confident it'll land well, you're not comfortable enough with the people you're playing with, or comfortable enough in their reactions to that kind of tampering, just don't include it until there's a situation where it comes up. Keep this as a tool in your DM toolbox that you can use when the time is right. Don't try and kind of wrench it into an already existing story that it doesn't really fit in, or into a group that won't respond well to it just because you came up with it in the moment.
And it's much easier to get away with this kind of thing if the twist that you're doing is the farther removed it is from the player character's direct backstory, the easier it is to get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
If you want them to be, to have noble blood, it's easier if you start stepping back farther and farther generations.
Mm-hmm.
This character was raised by farmers, but both his parents are still alive, living in the little family farm, back in the downs of whatever kingdom he's from. It's like he's got his immediate family pretty well figured out, and that's this character's sort of whole backstory. Is they're just like, well, I was farming and then I became an adventurer. Messing with that gets very personal, and you need to be more careful about. But if you start dealing with grandparents, great-grandparents, ancestors, that feels like it's sort of taking their immediate backstory into account and then just sort of like putting something back behind it, which is much less likely to offend anyone, much easier to get away with. And those can be small reveals too. They don't have to be big, impactful ones.
And I think it's very helpful if it is either mechanically or story-wise a positive for the group. To put in a reference that only some people will get, Knight's Tale. If you've ever seen the movie A Knight's Tale, great movie, kind of weird with music, but I like the music choices they make in it. Anyway, there's kind of this ending thing, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen this very old movie at this point. There's this kind of peasant man who wants to change his stars.
Was young in that movie, and he died a long time ago.
So R.I.P., great actor. But he is this kind of peasant who kind of is under the guise of a knight and wants to change his stars. He wants to become a noble. And at the end, it's not exactly explicitly said whether this is legitimate or not, or kind of more the person that they befriend, tricking it, whatever. It is this, like, he is of a ancient lineage of nobility that they're able to track down, and he ends up kind of being knighted by this king, and it's this cool moment. If it's that, if your character's like, my backstory is super humble, but he has great aspirations, and there's this moment where he's like, it's now or never, and I don't have the legal backing, and then it's like, yeah, but you and the wizard pore over the pages in the history annals, and you find this ancient nobility line that you can trace yourself back to, and that is like something they didn't write into their backstory, but you added into it for them to get that bonus in that moment.
Right.
I think that can be a really huge, cool thing. Another example of this, spoiler alert for anyone who's not watching our Epic 6 game right now, something you incorporated into my character's backstory is my character is kind of playing this elvish Greek demigod wannabe, right? He's Hercules wannabe.
He's very much styling himself after and trying to be a sort of ancient Greek hero.
Exactly. And then I find later on that through speaking to not necessarily omnipotent, but strange and powerful beings, that my bloodline ties back to a demigod of a hero of old. And that's not something I wrote into my character's backstory. That's not something I ever intended or thought of in my character's backstory. It's something you added that I found cool. You knew that I would find that cool, and it ties right in with my character. It's not counter to what my character is.
Well, and it's sort of, and then it sort of makes the armor that you get, that you sort of track down not long after that, feel more worthwhile.
Personal.
Exactly, it's more personal. It's getting a hold of that isn't just like, look at this sweet loot we stole from that cave, woohoo! It's like, this is mine. This belongs to me.
This is my inheritance.
This is my family's. I didn't know that until a couple days ago, but this is mine. This is, this has been, left to me. And that, that's an excellent way to build some of that personal attachment. And that, if you do this right, by, introducing elements, by changing elements of a character's backstory, by having that little twist in there, that's the hope. That's what you want, is that reveal to Luke that his father was a Jedi Knight and giving him the lightsaber, and it's a sort of immediate personal attachment to this thing, and it's, and it invests him in the main story, but it makes him want to pursue the truth of that and find out, what it meant to be a Jedi. And player characters will get that automatically. If this is done right, the player character is going to get this immediate attachment to some concept or some item or something that they begin to view as theirs by right, which is how you begin to, inspire them on to other... The character discovering that they're the son of the deposed king, and it's like, well, we've been fighting this tyrant the whole campaign anyway, and we totally hate the asshole.
And now I have a right to rule instead of him.
So it's like, so not only do we hate the guy because he's a jerk, but, like... He's sitting in my chair, damn it. Like, that's my house up there. Like, we're going to go get it back. Like, all of a sudden, there's a personal attachment to the things that you're doing. Exactly. Although that was your backstory. I didn't write that.
But anyway.
But, that's the hope, right? That's what you want, is to get that cool twist reveal and immediately foster that attachment to concepts or items or places.
So kind of in closing, do it. Sparingly, and when you're confident it'll land well.
Right.
And try and follow along with making sure that is not something counter character, unless that is something that's like discussed or opened by the way the player built their backstory intentionally, and typically make it something that is a boon or a driving factor towards a story element that the character would want to pursue anyways. Right. Make it make sense and make it positive for the player.
And you can make it a kind of a hindrance, but that's, again, is another layer of, like, really making sure you know your play group, know your players, and, like, know the story that you're telling to know how well that type of thing's going to land.
And if you're not confident it'll land well, use this later.
Right.
Keep this kind of concept in your toolbox. It does not need to be with every character. It does not even need to be in play in every campaign, as we said before. So just think about it. If you think you can use it in a way that'll land well, consider it. Take the time, do the work, have the relationship with the player, and do it well so that it'll land well in your game.
Well, thank you all so much for watching. Lots of similar content, lots of similar questions floating around on the channel in one place or another. It's just conversations we're kind of always having in regards to this hobby that we love so much. So go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.